He came to show everyone who he owned, except he forgot who he was speaking to. The private room at Hansang was half light and hot with steam. A line of low lamps hung like moons over lacquered tables. The smell of roasted sesame and braised beef braided through the air. In the corner, a polished mahogany tray bore neat stacks of side dishes, each napkin fold perfect. Mr. Park, the owner, hovered at the doorway, wiping his palms on his apron, watching the door as if he could stamp courage into his chest. When Mr. Kim arrived, the room folded inward. He moved with the slow assurance of someone accustomed to public consumption. Men followed his glance and made space. His coat whispered money. A gold watch flashed as he raised a hand to signal the server. 3 men sat with him, faces shadowed and patient, like guards around some dangerous jewel. He surveyed the room and let a small smile do the work of a warning. Zora Williams was on her 3rd table. She'd been here 3 months, wearing an apron over a suit she no longer wore to the office. She knew the rhythm of the place, the morning deliveries, the blunt laugh of regulars, the way the line cooks cursed in Korean and half smiled when stressed. Her name tag said Zora in a cheap block font. It bounced with every tray she carried. The tag balanced a life she was keeping upright. An ailing mother at home, a younger brother scraping toward college, unpaid bills filed like quiet accusations. She'd accepted this shift because diplomacy had been a slow, ancient thing to heal after a bad reorganization. State Department analyst, East Asia desk. Those were words in her past now, practical tools under her ribcage. She knew codes and country risk and the quiet ways people hid their intentions through routine. She knew Busan dialect, a voice of gravel and sea. She'd learned it in study, in fieldwork, in translation of intercepted chatter. She carried it like a folded map. Mr. Kim caught her eye when she approached his table. He tested her with a glance. An old tactic. Reduce 2 people to the power difference between them and see what it bought. Bring the jampong, but make it Busan style. Thicker stock, extra anchovy paste, and tell the kitchen to add the pork neck. And don't forget the naengchae on the side. We like it cold enough to bite. He delivered the order fast, the words clipped with a regional cadence, a Busan slip that anyone from there would hear. It was precise to the point of showmanship, an obscure preference named to paint the waitress as ignorant. He finished with something meant to be a knife, a casual, ugly barb, a racist jibe targeting her heritage and station, phrased in a dialect and tone chosen to humiliate. The laugh that followed was the kind that asks for others to laugh too. The room leaned with him. Servers froze. Mr. Park's hand went to his throat as if to check that his voice remained inside him. Zora set the tray down with practiced steadiness. The chopstick tins clinked. For 3 measured seconds she did not answer. She held his look and let the noise of the kitchen fill the space between them. The chop of cleaver, the hiss of oil. Her breath evened. She was a woman who had learned to count heartbeats before a decision. She counted the room. 1, 2, 3. And then she spoke. She answered in the same Busan hurry and cut, her syllables folding around the kitchen terms as though they'd been born there. Her voice carried the salt and wind of southern ports, but her words had the precision of someone who could read a manifest and a menu in the same breath. Thicker stock, extra anchovy paste, good for masking cheaper tear, she said, not in academic tones, but like someone naming a flaw the way a mechanic might name a worn belt. Pork neck, grill, not braise, char the edge, don't over-render it. Naengchae, keep it at 32 degrees, ice-chilled. And tell your men to stop acting like they own the table. They don't know how to eat anything, much less respect it. Silence snapped like a wire. Nobody laughed anymore. The 3 men at Mr. Kim's table stared first at her mouth, then at each other. Their amusement hardened into something like presence, immediate and heavy. Mr. Kim's smile thinned and changed into an appraisal that no longer had the comfort of power. The words were plain English in their meaning, and they carried something far sharper than technical instruction, recognition. Zora had not only named his preferences, she had matched his tone, his slang, the particular half-grammar of his region, and she had folded contempt into it, a careful, dignified contempt that stole his stage. Mr. Park's face was a map of fear and apology. He stepped forward with the compulsory deferential smile small business owners keep in a country that measures debts in reputations. "I'm sorry, sir. There's been a misunderstanding," he began. "She's new. She knows what tear is," Mr. Kim said. The 2 syllables were an accusation wrapped in a gourmet reference. "Where did you learn that?" Zora did not explain. She could have said where. Fieldwork, a fellowship in Busan, late nights translating intercepts for a job nobody thanked her for. Those were details that would have sunk into the floor of the dining room like timid coins. Instead, she kept the posture of someone who'd been taught to be careful with words. A diplomat doesn't tell a room her resume when a firewall will do. Mr. Kim smiled, a slow, polite thing that acted as a scalpel. A pretty girl with a sharp mouth. Cute. Maybe she thinks she's one of us. He spoke lightly, then added a barb that reshaped the room. A mocking phrase, built to remind her and everyone watching of her place. It touched on stereotypes. It suggested she was out of her depth. The men with him chuckled to cover the sudden electrical change. Zora looked across the lacquer. Her hands did not shake. "Sir," she said, in plain English now, "if you want the jampong I described, I can ask Chef Min to prepare it. If you want to talk about respect—" "Respect," Mr. Kim said, as if he tasted the word and found it coarse. "Respect is earned. We earn it. You should know how it works." He was testing her, and he expected a small woman to shrink, to apologize, to lower herself so he could enjoy the sight of domination. He expected the room to nod and close back around him as a crown. Instead, Zora's expression took on the kind of quiet that had instruments inside it: recalculation, threat assessment, a memory of dossiers and phone calls, and a life where language was a key. "Respect," she said, "isn't a currency you spend to humiliate someone else." Mr. Kim's amusement soured. He touched his phone. A server flinched. The men tightened. He liked the habit of being feared. Fear was useful in keeping a business favorable to him. He barked a command in Korean, not the Busan-clipped syllables this time, but neutral soul tones, and a gray-suited subordinate leaned into the doorway, dialed, and smiled at the phone like it was a ceremonial stone. "You'll have to show your papers," Mr. Kim said. "We check who hires who. We make sure the staff are clean." His finger tapped a rhythm on the table. "We make sure nothing embarrassing happens. We keep the place respectable." Mr. Park's apology stretched thin. "Mr. Kim, please. This is my restaurant. I can handle it." "Your restaurant," he repeated. The possessive carried menace. "Do not make me laugh." Zora's jaw moved once. Her mind had already begun to map the next steps. What words mattered, which file names to whisper, what to document and to whom. Her State Department life had been technical at its core. Cables, names, dates, manifests, shell companies that hid the flow of money, shipping records that told stories of illicit cargo, corporate filings and voided addresses. Those skills had been rendered obsolete by office politics, but they remained as reliable as a compass when night came down. She had used them before, in a different posture, not to shame, but to stabilize. She had never used them to blunt a man so publicly, but she had learned how evidence could be a kind of armor. Mr. Kim laughed and pressed the phone to his ear. He called someone who could introduce a problem into Zora's life, someone who could ask questions of Mr. Park about who he allowed to work in the restaurant, someone who could make the city's inspectors take an inconvenient interest in health codes and licenses. That would be enough to threaten Mr. Park's livelihood. That would be enough to make Zora consider the consequences for a mother who depended on her checks, a brother who needed tuition. She felt the ledger of risk against the ledger of dignity. Keep the job and keep her family afloat, or stand and risk everything to not be reduced. The room held its breath like a forced audience awaiting a verdict. "Do you have a problem, girl?" one of the men asked, his voice low. He leaned forward as if the air between them might be flammable. Zora had been trained to answer dangerous questions. She answered with a fact, because facts were least likely to be misinterpreted. "I'm not your girl," she said, "and I am not afraid to tell the truth." That phrase set the men off like wind to thin paper. Mr. Kim's voice rose a degree. "You know how to speak my dialect, and yet you flaunt it like a trick. Why, are you playing at being clever, or are you—" "Qualified," Zora supplied. "I have a background in East Asia analysis. I speak the dialect because I worked there. I understood your order because it's common among chefs from Busan who trained in seaport kitchens. I understand more than you expect." Her voice did not plead. It informed. Mr. Kim's face tightened. Recognition, that early flash of appraisal, flipped into annoyance. "So you know things. Dangerous things," he drawled. "We do not like those who watch us while they serve." Mr. Park interposed, hands shaking. "Please, sir, this is a misunderstanding. We will ask her to step outside." "Don't," Zora said, and the word sounded like laying down a challenge. Don't fire me for their entertainment." At that, Mr. Kim's patience drained. He wanted the show to continue, wanted the humiliation to complete. He straightened, the chair scraping. He made a perfunctory wave toward the door and spoke a name that made Mr. Park flinch. "Check her," he ordered. "Find out who she is. I'll have people look into her past." A silence like the press of a heavy curtain fell. Servers busied themselves with forced efficiency. Zora felt the future pool at her feet, an audition for losing everything. Her internal scale tipped hard toward the practical: pay for the surgery her mother needed, buy books for her brother, keep a roof over them. The weight was almost physical. And then, from the far end of the room, a soft applause broke the thick air. General Park Jun had been sitting at the sushi counter, an unassuming figure in a well-cut jacket and a face that had seen age and many maps. He had let his eyes rest where age and habit had taught him to look, at people who moved like they had something to hide, and at people who moved like they had something to prove. He had been watching the exchange not as a man unfamiliar with power, but as someone who had once sat on the other side of it, who had learned the patience of watching rot reveal itself. He rose now with the slow authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without ordaining it. He walked over and put a hand on Mr. Park's shoulder. "Mr. Park," he said in a voice that made the room align itself again. "Please, let the woman finish her duty in peace." The men at Mr. Kim's table turned like so many dials. Mr. Kim's face folded into a new shape, irritation, quickly covered by civility. "General Park," he said. The title had weight, and the man acknowledged it with a nod that was part calculation, part respect. Though both men had histories the public did not know, on the solitary stage of Hansang, General Park's arrival changed the variables. General Park looked at Zora like someone recognizing a colleague at a ceremony. "You," he began, then paused and offered her a small private smile. He knew who she was, and the recognition in his eyes was not for show. It held the soft concern of someone who had lost contact with a person he once valued. "You are not a server by accident." Zora felt a current of relief, like cool water on a fevered hand. The man had seen her without the lens of class. He had seen competence. He had also seen danger. Mr. Kim recovered his good manners with practiced speed. "General," he said, "what a pleasure to see you here. We were just discussing service. Our friend here has a sharp tongue." General Park's gaze didn't waver from Zora. "Sometimes the sharpest tongues are the most useful," he said. "If someone is asking for trouble, Mr. Kim, it is better to be specific about what kind of trouble you want." It was an ambiguous warning, but it was enough. Mr. Kim's cheeks flushed with a color that wasn't anger so much as the first showing of being outmaneuvered in public. The men shifted like predators denied gratification. Zora stepped back, letting General Park's presence do its work. Behind the normal diplomacy of that quiet exchange, something older and deeper asserted itself: the logic of institutions. Power could move through private violence and intimidation, but it also moved through documents, orders, legal standing, and reputational chains. General Park's recognition was a small beam that could reveal a web. After a few tense, barbed sentences traded across the lacquer, Mr. Kim called a temporary halt. He left instructions, both polite and pale threats, to Mr. Park about the staff he tolerated and those he did not. He left with his men in a procession that made the year-old leather chairs sigh. The room exhaled as they went. Mr. Park slumped in a way that betrayed relief and shame in one motion. When the door closed, General Park turned to Zora. He slid an envelope across the table to Mr. Park, a small weighted thing that had the smell of paper and authority. "Keep your staff," the envelope said, without words. "Do not let fear be rent from them." Then he rose and walked over to Zora. He put a hand briefly on her shoulder, in a manner that was protective and not patronizing. His eyes searched hers. "You used the right words," he said. "In the right order." "That was necessary," Zora replied with a nod. The field of their unspoken past was large. The general had served in countries where language and subtlety were weapons. He'd moved in circles that had known her competence and her caution. "I didn't want to be the cause of trouble," she said. "My mother, my brother." "I know," he replied. "I know what pressure looks like. You did the right thing by not answering with violence." He hesitated, and the hesitation carried a weight she could feel. "If you ever need someone to vouch for you, tell the truth about who you are. Tell them you worked with the team in D.C. Say you did the translations. Say you were useful. The envelope changed hands again, not as a gift, but as an assurance. General Park had something he could give that would navigate the institution Zora could not reach alone. A number, a name, a connection to a consulate officer who could listen. He handed Zora a card with a slight bow. "If Mr. Kim's interest grows beyond flavor preferences," he said quietly, "call this number." That night the reality of risk did not vanish. It shifted. Zora still had bills to pay, a brother who would need tuition, a mother who would need care. She put the card into her apron pocket like an antidote. She went back to work and served with steady hands. Each played a small petition for normalcy. The call from Mr. Kim's lieutenant came 3 days later. Their inquiries had turned to internet searches, and then to a brief look into public records. For a man used to people not asking questions, a file that did not match the expected civilian biography could be curious and prickling. They asked where she lived. They wanted to know if she had family who'd be exposed to consequences if something unpleasant happened to their breadwinner. They made it sound polite and legal, background checks enacted under the guise of concern for decorum. Zora documented everything. She wrote down names, times, descriptions. She sent emails to an address General Park had given her at the consular office. He had warned her that the process might be slow, that paper bureaucracy had its own rhythms and annoyances, but that once it moved with the weight of law. A retired general like him had friends who still respected his voice. He had given her a soft-lipped order to be patient and to be methodical. She used the skills that had once gotten her promoted, compiling lists, cross-referencing shipping registries, tracking company names that repeated like ghost addresses across filings. She scanned menus, contracts, a list of vendors who supplied Hansang. She found the thin thread that would metamorphose into a cord. A shell company registered in a neighborhood 2 boroughs away, with a nominee director listed at an address that paid no taxes. A pattern of transfers had been routed through another laundered account. A shipping manifest showed crates labeled as kitchen supplies, from a company with no kitchen listed on any municipal map. Small things, but consistent. The consulate did not move like a private muscle. It moved like an engine. People read the documents she submitted. Someone answered her emails a week later. A polite man with a tie and a voice that suggested careful protocol called and invited her to come in. He asked for a summary, he listened, and he assigned a liaison. That liaison called Mr. Park to verify the restaurant's claims and asked for permission to review payroll records. They asked for nothing public, nothing dramatic, just access. They issued a polite but firm request to Mr. Park not to make personnel decisions while the review was ongoing. When Mr. Kim realized that the consulate had been contacted, his posture changed in subtle ways that Zora noticed. His messages to Mr. Park changed from light menace to polite interest. His men still sat in their respective silence, but the shine of invulnerability had dulled. He had no love for bureaucracy. It was, in his world, slow and tedious, but it could also be lethal in its own way. Documents could cage him. A consular inquiry could connect tentacles of influence back to his clean face. Then General Park took it one step further. He used a friend still in the service, a man who had the old habit of making things happen without making them obvious. He provided the consulate with names they'd been reluctant to trust at first. He vouched for Zora in a manner that could not be faked. A call that said, in language of so many old men in uniforms, "She knows what she is doing. She is credible." The consulate moved a bit faster after that. The day the summons arrived, Zora felt the world tilt toward consequence. The letter was not a public spectacle. It was a clean, black-printed missive, a formal request for Mr. Kim to appear at the consulate for questioning regarding a set of transactions and allegations that touched international borders. The wording was careful. Legalese framed a charge of concern regarding undocumented transfers and suspicious commercial activity linked to a corporate network. The summons did not accuse him of everything. It did not pretend to take a gavel where law had to take its own steps. But it asked him to come and answer questions. Mr. Park received the summons like a man given a shovel at the top of a sinkhole. He called Mr. Kim and told him. Mr. Kim's laugh on the phone was cool and distant until it was not. He arrived at Hansang that afternoon with a different energy, a man who could sense that the rules had changed. He looked at Zora with a slow appraisal that asked, "Who brought this down?" His men were taut and not pleased. Zora walked into the consulate that day, wearing a coat that matched her resolve. She had done the work, the piles of scanned records, the lists of transfers, the vendors, the patterns. and she handed them over in neat folders. She explained, calmly and clearly, the way money moved through shell companies, how shipping manifests could be falsified, how personal transfers could be hidden in family trusts. She showed them the companies that lined up like ghosts, the addresses that were mail drops and not manufacturing facilities. She referenced restaurant supply procurement practices, and she explained why an order specifying a regional variation in a dish might be a marker, an unusual specificity used to convey signals to those who needed to know. The officials in the room listened. The liaison took notes. A consular attorney frowned at a spreadsheet and then at a map. Questions were asked and answered. The thing was no dramatic courtroom scene. It was a bureaucratic setting that had power because it kept careful records and followed process. It had the virtue of being allowed to ask questions that private actors could not. Meanwhile, Mr. Kim was summoned. His men clamored like caged birds. He answered and arrived with the arrogance of someone who had never been forced to explain himself to anyone who could not be bought. When the consular official read him the concerns, he smiled the smile of someone for whom consequences were theoretical, until he saw the files. The officers presented a sequence of financial transfers traced into his businesses, invoices that lined up like footprints, and shipping manifests that connected to addresses that were not what they claimed. There were no sudden arrests. There were questions, subpoenas threatened, legal doors opened. Mr. Kim watched, and his face showed a kind of private fear akin to dizziness. "You seem to have an explanation," one official said, not unkindly. "We would like to hear it." Mr. Kim, who had always commanded rooms by shading the light out of them, found the spotlight reductive. He stammered through explanations that were precise in their evasiveness. He offered names that could be manipulated. He provided accounts that did not withstand the scrutiny of a clerk who knew where to look. The consular officers had the patience to see how thin the defenses were. They had the power to ask a district attorney in a pragmatic voice to consider whether a proper inquiry was merited. They had a way of making private threats look petty against the institutional machine of investigation. When Mr. Kim left the consulate, his step lacked his usual public assurance. He had not been arrested. He had not been publicly humiliated in the way his earlier behavior sought to inflict. But he had been exposed, put into a position where paperwork could be read by people who did not answer to him. The glass of impunity that he had sipped from had been put on a table in plain view. He could no longer be sure that a phone call would make a prosecutor blink. He could no longer assume that city inspectors would look with the other eye at the details of his accounts. The ripples reached Hansang. Inspectors asked to see employee records. Vendors received calls that asked about invoices. Banks received queries they could not ignore. Mr. Park, who had stood at the doorway like a man with only his business as a shield, received a note that said, with gentle cruelty, that his submission to outside pressures was questionable. Zora was not invited to parades or anniversaries. The victory was not flashy. It smelled of paper and coffee and the antiseptic tang of municipal offices. But her comptroller traits had not failed. Thoroughness, patience, documentation. She did not wear a uniform to reclaim her life. She wore a resume of evidence that made a man used to buying silence find himself naked in the quiet of a legal process. When she returned to Hansang, the room felt different. Patrons were polite. Mr. Park's eyes were wet with a gratitude he could not translate into words that would be appropriate. In time, the consulate wrote to say that they would keep an eye on follow-up matters, and that in the event of further issues Zora should be assured that the channels existed. It was not heroics. It was institutional scaffolding that, once reattached to someone like her, offered a ladder back up. Zora used the attention carefully. She reactivated networks she had let go cold. She spoke to contacts who could recommend her for consultancy. She wrote succinctly and honestly about a career she had paused only temporarily. Slowly, invitations came for translation work, for analysis, for a role that would let her combine language with evidence. It was not a dramatic reinstatement or a news headline. It was a rebuilding, gradual and stubborn. Her brother accepted his scholarship and called her once with a voice that made her want to cry with relief. Her mother's neck surgery went ahead because they could afford one now without the threat of losing heat in the winter. Mr. Kim's world contracted. He found that the men who had once followed his orders now looked at him with precaution. Restaurants gave him fewer public entrances. His men joked less, and when they laughed it sounded as if they were testing whether he could still enforce the rules. He continued to move through buildings, but with a different rhythm. Faster calls to lawyers, slower nights on display. The man who had expected to humiliate a waitress in front of his cronies instead found himself the subject of disinterested forms and questions. There was no cinematic collapse, no rooftop arrest or dramatic confession forced by gunfire. Instead, Mr. Kim learned what it meant to be made accountable in a language he could not shape with money and habit. He discovered that institutions could not be bought the way waitstaff could be silenced. That knowledge returned to the room like an echo of the laughter he had once expected. In the weeks after, Zora sometimes found herself watching the street where Hansang breathed. A woman who had once been sure of diplomatic briefs and tonal nuance now carried the lighter armor of someone who had used work and evidence rather than threat and bravado. She kept the card General Park had given her in a drawer at home. She also kept printed copies, redacted and anonymized, of the record she had given to the consulate. She taught herself to think of documentation as a form of care, and in that teaching she found a kind of quiet joy. Mr. Park's restaurant remained. He added a small plaque inside, an unadvertised note that the place honored its staff and their dignity. People asked, and he said, "We will not be a stage for private displays of ownership." He did not raise it as manifesto. He lived it in private gestures, in the way staff were scheduled and treated. Hansang continued to serve its food, and patrons returned for the dishes and the calm. The final scene was not triumphant in any loud way. It was restorative. Zora accepted a consulting offer that allowed flexible hours and better pay. Her brother wrote to say his first semester had gone well. Her mother's health improved incrementally. General Park ate at Hansang one evening and raised his cup to hers in a small, solemn toast. No words spared, because none were necessary. There was one last public moment, a neighborhood fundraiser where Mr. Kim, predictably, chose not to attend. The talk in the room was about small businesses and dignity. A young server, new, untested, spilled a tray of kimchi onto a floor, and then, with a small laugh, kept serving anyway. Someone at a nearby table snapped a smile. They had learned, without fanfare, a lesson about who is easy to underestimate. Zora stood by the counter that night and watched the kitchen steam wreath around the lights. She thought about the 3 seconds before she had answered Mr. Kim the first time, the way a past life had folded into a present that had almost swallowed her. She thought of the pages she had printed, the people who had chosen to listen, and the small, inflexible logic that had guided her. Documentation beats boasts. Procedure beats fury. She had not gone looking for a battle. But when someone thought to humiliate her by speaking in a language she was assumed not to understand, when he thought to flaunt power by reducing another human being, he had picked the wrong woman. He did not know that the person he had aimed to shame had worked in rooms where language was a tool and proof a weapon. He did not know that she had a retired general who remembered her usefulness, or that the consulate could move with quiet, institutional inevitability. It was not revenge in the cinematic sense. It was a restoration of order through channels designed to prevent the very kind of private justice Mr. Kim preferred. Zora had used her knowledge to make the private world of intimidation meet the public world of evidence. She had protected herself, her family, and a small business with the patient instruments of law and truth. If you were in her shoes, what would you have done? Would you have stayed quiet to protect the paycheck, or stood up and risked everything for dignity? Comment below with what you would have chosen. If this story made you think, like and subscribe for more stories where the underdog turns the tide. Not with fists, but with wit, work, and the slow power of institutions.